like, and make sure to engage in comments. Also, share this video to your friends and story lovers, and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifex for more real horror stories like this. It started as one of those weekends you never really plan, but just sort of happen. Kevin, Danny, and Josh had been talking about a fishing trip for weeks, but no one had actually made any solid arrangements. Then, out of nowhere, Danny brought up an old fishing spot his uncle used to rave about. Way out in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods, past an old resort that had been shut down for years. According to Danny's uncle, the place used to be packed with people. A real hidden gem for fishing. But one day, everyone just stopped going. No one knew why. That should have been a red flag, but of course, being young and stupid, they saw it as an adventure. A secret fishing spot, completely untouched for years? That sounded like the perfect place to get away, crack open some beers, and fish without dealing with crowds. Josh was the only one who hesitated at first. He wasn't superstitious, but something about the way Danny described the place made his stomach turn. He brushed it off, though. Maybe he was just overthinking things. So they packed up, threw their gear into Danny's truck, and hit the road. It was a long drive, longer than any of them expected. The last town they passed was nearly an hour behind them, and the roads got worse the closer they got. Potholes, overgrown trees, and long stretches where the asphalt had completely given up. By the time they reached the turnoff, it was almost dark, and a thick fog had started rolling in. The entrance to the old resort was completely blocked off with a rusted chain and a faded "No Trespassing" sign. The guys didn't care. They were here for the fishing spot, not the resort. Danny pulled the truck around to a hidden dirt path his uncle had mentioned, and within minutes, they were bouncing down a narrow, overgrown trail. The spot itself was eerie, but not in a ghost story kind of way, at least not yet. It was just too quiet. No birds, no bugs, nothing. Just the sound of the lake slapping against the shore. The water was darker than they expected, almost black. And the dock was half rotten, but the guys didn't care. They set up camp, built a fire, and settled in for the night. At first, everything seemed fine. They drank, told stories, laughed about stupid things. But as the night wore on, things started to feel off. Josh was the first to notice. He kept glancing over his shoulder, swearing he heard something moving just outside the firelight. Kevin laughed it off, saying it was probably a deer. But then Danny heard it too. Slow, deliberate steps crunching through the brush. They shined their flashlights toward the trees, expecting to see an animal, maybe even another person. Nothing. Just thick woods and endless darkness. The weirdest part? The second they turned off the lights, the noises started again. Slow, circling them. Josh wanted to leave right then and there, but Danny, being the stubborn one, refused. "We came all this way," he said. "I'm not leaving just because of some creepy sounds in the woods." Kevin agreed. Maybe it was just the wind, or their own paranoia. They tried to ignore it, forced themselves to keep drinking and laughing. But the laughter felt forced now. The fun was gone. At some point, Josh got up to take a piss by the water. The second he stepped away from the fire, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like if he turned around too fast, he'd see something. Something he didn't want to see. Then, just as he was finishing up, something splashed in the water. Not a small splash, not a fish. This was big. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The guys heard it too. "What the hell was that?" Kevin whispered. Danny grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the water. For a second, they didn't see anything. Then, just as Danny was about to turn the light away, something moved. A shape, just below the surface. Josh swore it looked like a hand. A pale, bloated hand reaching up from the depths before disappearing into the black water. That was it. Josh backed away so fast he nearly tripped over himself. "We need to go," he said, his voice shaking. "Now." But Danny still wasn't convinced. "It was probably just a log," he argued, "or an old fishing net. You guys are freaking out over nothing." Josh wasn't buying it. "That was not a damn log, Danny." Kevin was caught in the middle. He didn't know what he saw, but the look on Josh's face was enough to put him on edge. "Let's just sleep in the truck tonight," he suggested. "If it still feels weird in the morning, we can leave." Danny sighed, but gave in. "Fine, but you guys are acting like babies." They put out the fire and climbed into the truck. Danny and Kevin passed out pretty fast, but Josh couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. He kept his eyes on the lake, half expecting to see that hand again. At some point, exhaustion won, and Josh finally drifted off. But just before sunrise, something tapped against the window. Soft at first, then harder. A slow, deliberate knock. And when Josh opened his eyes, his stomach dropped. Because standing right outside the truck, barely visible in the dim morning light, was a soaking wet figure, silent, motionless, staring right at him. Josh couldn't breathe. His chest locked up, his mind screaming at him to move, to shout, to do something, but he was frozen. His eyes were locked on the figure outside the truck, its face obscured by the foggy window. The longer he stared, the more his brain refused to process what he was looking at. It wasn't just some random person. The figure was wrong. The clothes it wore were soaked through, dripping onto the ground. But that wasn't what disturbed him the most. It was the way it stood, unnaturally stiff, shoulders hunched forward as if every muscle had seized up. The head tilted slightly, like it was listening, waiting. Josh wanted to believe it was some fisherman or a lost hiker, but deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. Then it moved. Not like a normal person shifting their weight or adjusting their stance. No, this was off. A sudden, jerky twitch, like something puppeteering a dead body, testing the limits of its control. Josh's throat went dry. He needed to wake Danny and Kevin, but he was terrified to take his eyes off the thing. If he looked away, even for a second, he felt like it would lunge at the truck. The knocking came again. 3 slow, deliberate taps against the glass. Josh jumped, his hand flying to Danny's shoulder, shaking him violently. "Wake up," he whispered, his voice barely coming out. "Danny, wake up right now." Danny groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What the hell, man?" Before Josh could answer, the knocking came again. This time, it wasn't just on his window. It was on Kevin's too. Danny sat up instantly. "What was that?" Josh pointed at the window, and Danny turned his head just in time to see the figure outside. For a split second, neither of them spoke. Then Danny made the worst mistake possible. He reached for the handle. Josh slapped his hand away so hard it stung. "Are you insane?" he hissed. Danny's mouth opened, but no words came out. His face went pale as he took in the figure properly for the first time. He must have realized what Josh already knew. This wasn't normal. This wasn't human. Kevin stirred in the back seat, groaning. "What's going on?" Before anyone could answer, the figure did something that turned Josh's stomach inside out. It grinned. The fog on the window made it hard to see clearly, but there was no mistaking it. The shape of a wide, unnatural smile pressing against the glass, stretching too far, too thin, as if the skin itself was cracking. Danny let out a sharp breath, scrambling backward. "Drive," he whispered. Josh didn't need to be told twice. He shoved the keys into the ignition, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped them. The truck roared to life, and at that exact moment, the thing outside slammed its palm against the window. It was loud, way louder than it should have been, like a wet slab of meat hitting a wall. Kevin shot up, fully awake now. "What the hell was that?" Josh didn't answer. He threw the truck into reverse, slamming his foot on the gas. The tires spun in the damp earth for a moment before catching traction, sending them lurching backward. The figure remained completely still, watching them as they sped away. It didn't chase them. It didn't move at all. It just stood there, smiling. Josh didn't slow down. He didn't care about the rough terrain, the potholes, the low-hanging branches that scraped against the truck like skeletal fingers. He just kept driving, desperate to put as much distance between them and that thing as possible. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The only sounds were the engine's roar and their own panicked breathing. Finally, Kevin found his voice. What the hell was that?" Josh shook his head. "I don't know. I don't want to know." Danny was silent, gripping his seat so tightly his knuckles were white. The road stretched ahead, winding through dense trees. The fog was thicker now, rolling in waves that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Josh's hands were slippery with sweat, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. Then the truck jerked violently. Something had hit the back, not a rock, not a pothole, something heavy. Kevin twisted in his seat, peering through the rear window. "Oh my God," he choked out. Josh didn't want to look. He really didn't. But he did. And what he saw made his stomach drop to his feet. The figure was behind them, not running, not chasing. It was just there, sitting in the truck bed. Kevin screamed. Danny swore. Josh did the only thing he could. He floored it. The truck roared forward, bouncing violently over the uneven road. The thing in the back didn't move. It just sat there, still soaking wet, still grinning. Its head tilted ever so slightly, like it was studying them, enjoying their fear. Josh's vision blurred with panic. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get the hell out of there. The road twisted sharply, and in his desperation, he barely managed to yank the wheel in time. The truck skidded, the tires screamed, and then, impact. The world spun. The last thing Josh saw before everything went black was the figure in the back, still smiling, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Darkness. A heavy, suffocating weight pressed against Josh's chest. His head throbbed, his vision swimming as he struggled to understand where he was. The sharp scent of gasoline and damp earth filled his nostrils. Something warm dripped down his forehead. Blood. The truck had crashed. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the groan of metal shifting, the faint crackle of something in the distance, like wet footsteps squelching through mud. Josh gasped, his body snapping into motion. He turned his head, wincing as pain flared through his skull. The windshield was shattered, a spider web of cracks spreading out from where they'd hit something. The truck had slammed sideways into a tree. The hood crumpled like tinfoil. The headlights flickered weakly, casting eerie, uneven beams into the dense fog surrounding them. Danny was slumped against the passenger door, his face slack, unconscious. Kevin lay twisted in the back seat, groaning, his fingers twitching. They were alive. But for how long? Josh tried to move, but something felt wrong. His body was sluggish, disconnected, like his limbs weren't fully under his control. Panic surged in his throat. He needed to get out of here. And then he heard it. A wet, dragging sound. His breath hitched. He didn't want to look. He couldn't look. But something deep inside him, the primal part of his brain that recognized real, undeniable danger, forced him to turn his head. Through the broken windshield, past the swirling fog, something was standing just beyond the light's reach. It was closer now, and it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the mist, their bodies shifting unnaturally, as if they weren't meant to move on land. Their heads lolled at strange angles, water dripping from their limp fingers. The same grotesque grins stretched across their faces, too wide, too thin, like their skin had been pulled too tight over their skulls. Josh felt like he was drowning. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out everything except the wet sound of their footsteps drawing closer. He tried to shake Danny awake, slapping his arm weakly. "Danny, wake up! Wake up!" Danny stirred, groaning. His eyes fluttered open, hazy with confusion. "What?" Josh didn't have time to explain. He reached for the door handle, ignoring the pain screaming through his body. They had to move. But then, something grabbed his ankle, cold, slimy. Josh's scream barely made it past his lips before he was yanked backward. He clawed at the seat, at the dashboard, anything to stop himself from being pulled out of the wreckage. But the grip was impossibly strong. His body slid across the glass-covered floor of the truck, his nails scraping against the interior as he fought. Danny saw it then. His eyes widened in horror, his body snapping fully awake. "Josh!" Kevin lurched forward, reaching for him, but it was too late. The thing yanked him out. Josh hit the ground hard, his breath knocked from his lungs. He gasped, his fingers digging into the wet dirt as he tried to scramble away. But it was still holding him. He turned his head, just in time to see it crouching over him. Up close, the thing was even worse than he'd imagined. Its skin was wrinkled and waterlogged, peeling in places to reveal the raw, pulpy flesh beneath. Its eyes were nothing but black pits, hollow and endless. And that smile, it was as if the corners of its mouth had been cut open, the flesh barely holding together. It leaned in closer. The smell of rot and seawater burned Josh's nose. Its lips barely moved, but he heard it. A voice that wasn't a voice at all, just a whisper, a breath of something ancient and wrong. "You shouldn't have come here," Josh thrashed wildly, kicking, punching, anything to break free. The thing barely reacted. Its grip tightened, its nails biting into his skin. Then, out of nowhere, Danny's voice, raw and desperate. "Let go of him!" A dull thunk rang through the air as Danny swung a broken tree branch at the creature's head. The impact sent a sickening squelch through the night, and for the briefest moment, the thing let go. Josh didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his leg, and ran. Danny and Kevin were right behind him, their breaths ragged, their movements frantic. The forest was a blur of shadows and fog, branches slashing at their skin as they sprinted blindly. But the sounds never stopped. The dragging footsteps, the whispering voices, the feeling of something just inches behind them. Josh's lungs burned. His legs threatened to give out. But then, through the thick fog, he saw it. The faint glimmer of water. The lake. A terrible realization crashed into him. This wasn't a rescue. This was a trap. The figures weren't chasing them away from the lake. They were leading them back. Josh skidded to a stop, his chest heaving. "Wait, stop, we can't." Danny didn't hear him. He was already sprinting forward towards the shoreline. And that's when Josh saw them, rising from the water. Dozens of them. Half submerged, their eyes locked onto the boys, their grins wider than ever. Their arms stretched out, waiting. Danny's foot hit the wet sand. Josh tried to scream, and then the hands erupted from the water, grabbing, pulling. Danny's body disappeared beneath the surface. Kevin's scream cut through the night as more hands surged up, clawing at the air, reaching for them. Josh took a step back, then another, but something cold wrapped around his ankle again, and this time he knew there was no escaping. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifex for more real and true stories like this.